It'll take a few minutes for it all to sync up here.
Greetings from Okinawa, Japan. Really excited to see this one, guys.
Hey, Mike.
Good to see you, Mike.
Yeah, good to see you.
Hello, everybody. Hey, Mike.
Hello.
Hey, Tom.
Jennifer.
Tom.
Hey, my Irish friends.
All right. So I think some more people will probably be coming in, but we'll get started. Welcome, everybody, to Now I'm Losing Count, the next week in our Tenacious Live series. Tonight, we have a really special presentation. And before I introduce it, I also just want to thank these guys for staying up late for us because it's 11 p.m. their time, and they're ready to go and talk about shipwrecks. So I want to welcome Barry McGill and Stewie Andrews, divers diving and working in Ireland, diving some deep stuff, making discoveries, and just doing some amazing things off the Irish coast. We actually overlapped a little bit on our Lusitania expedition this last summer and had a chance to at least talk with Stewie. I don't think that Barry was quite there yet. And kind of talk about some of their adventures and just really fascinating, really beautiful shipwrecks. So they're here tonight to talk about warships, U-boats, and liners off the coast of Ireland. Thanks so much, guys. You can take it away.
Thank you.
Yeah. Stewie, I'll let you go first if you want.
Okay, so I just wanted to talk sort of generally. We don't really have a big long presentation. We have a couple of photos on each of about 6 race wrecks, which Barry's put together today. So really, I just wanted to talk about the visibility and the general conditions around Ireland. The Lusitania, as people probably know, is in the south end of Ireland, and it tends to be much choppier sort of water. So anything beyond a force of Beaufort, force 4, they tend to not really like going out down in the southern part of Ireland. Up in the northwest in Donegal, the visibility is much, much better, like significantly better. The Lusitania is not. The Lusitania tends to be a box ticker, to be honest with you. People like to tick a box, isn't that right, Jen? And up in Donegal, you have much, much better visibility, the best visibility in Ireland, in fact, and the visibility, you know, if it's anything less than 15 meters, because our skipper, one of our skippers up there asks us and records it every day, what people tell him when they get back in the boat. And if it's anything less than 15 meters, because he's asking us, we tend to give out to him, not that he's anything to do with the visibility, but because he's asked us, if it's less than 15 meters, we're sort of giving out, which is very unfair. So yeah. So the guns on Audacious, which is a World War I King George V battleship, top left of the picture that's being shared there, and that's actually a painting of it going down. That's a King George V super dreadnought battleship, super firing guns over guns, 10, 13.5-inch guns, and she's in 64 meters. So that is actually, she's mainly upside down, but she's a wreck that keeps on giving because she's opening up, and we can see much more now than we did even 10 years ago. And she's a beautiful wreck, a fallback wreck. It's about 15 miles from base up there in Donegal, and which is the northwest of Ireland. And it's the one that when you're all loaded up with Trimix, ready to dive something deep, and you can't go too far out in a force 5 or 5 and a bit, you tend to fall back to this one. And so it's really, really nice wreck. Do you have anything to say on that particular wreck, Barry?
No, I suppose just to give people an idea. So this is kind of a map of Ireland and the United Kingdom. But you can kind of see the big area that's kind of coloured. That's the seabed survey of Ireland that's been undertaken over the last kind of 10 to 15 years by the Irish government. And a lot of our wrecks come from this survey. So if you look, the whole coast of Ireland is pretty much covered in wrecks, other than maybe the west coast is quite limited. Well, we're very lucky to have such a wide variety of wrecks in Ireland. So you need to look at these are kind of the ones we picked out, like the Audacious, the Victoria, and the Cursor would all be kind of battlefields that were, or battleships that were all and then we have the liners and the U-boats then. So the likes of Donegal would have well over 130 to 140 U-boats just off the coast, because of Operation Deadlight and because of operations then during World War I and II itself. So we have a vast kind of wealth of kind of World War I and World War II shipwrecks off the coast. And we're very lucky as divers, I suppose, to be diving in an era where we can access them, because generally they're quite deep relative to shipwrecks in other places. So most of our shipwrecks start from about 60 meters, and then 180, 200 feet, and they go all the way down into kind of 160 plus meters is kind of where we've been able to go with them. So we've amassed kind of variety of shipwrecks, but they all generally tend to lie in quite deep water, relatively.
So one important thing is it mightn't be obvious to people why there are so many wrecks off the Irish coast. Of course, the Irish coast, north and south, were access points during World War I and World War II for ships and supplies and armies coming from Canada and, of course, the States. And the Allies were keeping Britain going during both wars, with clearly Britain itself probably could last a couple of weeks without all that help. That's all she could last. She couldn't make ships fast enough. We wouldn't have the steel, wouldn't have the the energy, the timber, or whatever is required to make steel. And the Germans were sinking at such a fantastic rate in both wars, sinking Allied ships. So that the war wouldn't have been won without the Americans and obviously troops come from Canada as well. So that they were the shipping lanes getting to the UK basically. And Barry was saying one of the confusing things about diving, particularly U-boats, is they're all much of a muchness lengthwise, 65 to 75 meters. And one of the difficult things is that there were 112 U-boats dumped at the end of the Second World War, with German U-boats. And they were an operation called Operation Deadlight in the February after the war ended, so February in 1946. And they were just dumped randomly. They were supposed to be all dumped below 100 meters depth, but 50% of them were and 50% of them weren't. And they sort of get in the way of what we're looking for, particularly World War I U-boats. And there's the operational U-boats. Dumped U-boats at the end of the war, fully decommissioned before they were dumped. Not as interesting as something that's operational. I think it's fairly obvious to wreck divers. If a U-boat or a boat went down fighting or not, there's a big difference in what you can see.
So I suppose for us, the main wreck we've dived over the years, are the one that I suppose everybody that comes to Ireland wants to dive, is the Audacious. So it's a World War I dreadnought battleship, and I suppose it's one of the few places in the world you can dive one of these ships with good visibility. And I think that's what makes a lot of Irish shipwreck diving, or the north coast of Ireland at least, shipwreck diving, stand out, that you can dive these wrecks and you can see large areas of them. I suppose one of the most iconic things in Irish wreck diving itself is the guns on Audacious that Stewie mentioned earlier, the 13.5-inch guns. And I suppose anybody that's come to Ireland, or any diver that's aspired to dive in Ireland, has kind of aspired to get to somewhere like here where you can kind of see the guns. I think for most divers that are coming to Donegal or the north coast of Ireland, their first point of call has to be something like the Audacious. And the guns, to get on the guns on the first day would be one of the highlights of the trip, I think. It's probably one of the most stony wreck, I think, that if you told me I had one wreck to dive forever, that would be the one wreck I'd pick as well. I don't know about you, Stewie.
Yeah, I think we call it the wreck that keeps on giving. And you can see the stern torpedo tube on the left there. You can see the divers actually fairly close there, because those rudders are pretty massive. And then you can't see in that shot the 4 screws. You can see them in that shot. You can just about see 4 screws, one in the extreme left, and there's another one sort of hidden behind it, and then the 2 more in the foreground. So she's broken at that point. That's the keel. The highest point there is the keel. And sometimes you can be way out here on the gravel, and you can see the divers coming down. The shot will be somewhere there where the high point is, and you can see the divers in the distance going down or going up or whatever. So you can see the gearing there for the rudders and everything, and the spilling out from under the wreck. So she is upside down, and fairly completely upside down, but the armor plate is giving her two sides, and now the top, which would have been the hull, of course, is opening up quite significantly, and the bow is broken off to one side. That's a sort of another area you can go to, off about 30 meters to one side. So she's pretty fascinating. Those screws actually are continuously falling as the keel, as you can see the keel on the right there, she's tipping over, and the screws were about 3 meters. One, that particular one there, is off the seabed, and as you can see, it's starting to go down into the seabed. So the wrecks are changing with there's massive winter storms in the North Atlantic come in here, and she's tall enough, in the upside down state, she's tall enough to be caught by those surges. And occasionally you do get surges coming through. They can sort of, for a minute, you have to hold on to something, and it surges, and then it just dies away, and then you carry on your dive. That does happen occasionally. HMS Victoria. So this was called an AMC, an armed merchant cruiser. She was pressed into war. I mean, at one point, this was owned by a university as their sort of run-around research vessel. But she's a clipper bow on the right there, the way it curves, so you can see it underwater, and that was one of the identifying features. We've never really found very much that you can say absolutely she's the Victor, but she's very definitely, and she really wasn't made for war. She only lasted about 3 or 4 months after the Admiralty requisitioned her, the British Admiralty. And to be honest with you, she was never going to last long, because the bulkheads and everything were very, very light. There was nothing there to keep her afloat once there was a hole in it anywhere. To be honest with you, she was never going to last long. And she was one we're pretty certain, we've no proof, we're pretty certain she hit the mine that the Audacious actually hit as well in World War I. So it was laid by a German liner called the SS Berlin. The Berlin was supposed to lay the mines further over towards the east to the Firth of Forth, closer to Scotland, but she heard an awful lot of radio chatter from that direction and decided to lay them here. Captain went back. I don't think he ever commanded a ship after that. They said, you didn't do your job right, but in fact, he did it very well. There's lots of ships that gone down due to that. He laid over 100, I think, mines, and it was a very successful minefield in the path of all these ships trying to get to and from Britain and patrol the area. So this was a patrol boat. I think she had one gun on the stern. Am I right in saying that, Barry, as far as I can remember?
Yeah, I think there's one stern gun, and then there's I think there's 3 or 4 forward of the engines.
Yeah, there's a pair either side of the front. Sorry, it's so long since we've been diving up there. It feels like years up there, but it's not. You just memory. So that's the engine right more or less in the center of the ship, and she's absolutely standing up. That's a huge big flywheel covered in Ophelia there. It's the beginning of where we start seeing the deep water corals. That white blob is the flywheel, and this Ophelia grows about 3, 4, 5 meters off the bottom in clear water, and it's a massive triple expansion engine, steam engine, and she's got 12 boilers.
8 boilers.
8 boilers, yeah.
I think that was one of the identifying features of the wreck. I think the 8 boilers. And so when we looked up the records, there was no other ships of that size sank with 8 boilers. So it was kind of one of the reasons. That and the bow itself, I think, were the 2 main reasons we were able to kind of identify it. Because nothing has ever come off it with the actual name of the ship, which is one of the kind of because there's very little left, I suppose. What you'll kind of notice with a lot of shipwrecks off Ireland, especially on the north coast, is that the engines, the boilers and the bows all survive, but the majority of the rest of the ship collapses and is quite flat. So it's not like diving in places like the Mediterranean, where you have like the Britannic and it's lying on the side. We don't generally get shipwrecks that anything from World War I or World War II generally doesn't stay intact enough. And I think one of the most impressive parts of the whole ship is the stern. Here's a picture of Stewie swimming over the single stern propeller. And I think one of the things that draws me to it, I suppose, this is at 86 meters. So what's that in feet? I'm not brilliant at that. But at 86 meters, you've still got ambient light on the wrecks. And visibility that day now was particularly good. But you're talking somewhere between kind of 90 feet, 100 feet of visibility on that particular day. Now it does change from day to day and from year to year. But if you did that particular day when you dropped down the shot line was near this engine, but you could actually see the bow and the stern from the engine. Which
282 feet is correct. Thank you very much. Somebody saying it there, but I checked it myself. 282 feet depth.
Yeah, and generally like that would be kind of a typical depth for the shipwrecks off Ireland. So somewhere between 60 to 90 meters would generally cover the majority of our shipwrecks. But this wreck's quite special, I think. One, because very little was known about the sinking until it was discovered by Stewart and members of a group called Dark Star back, I think it was 2006 or 7. Nobody had ever dived the shipwreck, but also the survivors never knew the location, or not the survivors, sorry, the families never knew the location of the wreck. And that was one of the things, by finding the shipwreck and being able to put a name to it, it actually allowed kind of, the families to have an idea of what happened to their loved ones, because wrecks like the Victoria, there has been no survivors. So it is something that all hands went down with the ship. And so it's kind of one of the things that I suppose brings us home to you, the kind of the importance of some of these ships.
Yeah, I think there's 279 or something souls lost, but in fact there's been research done, so it actually brought the number up to 300 people lost on this wreck, and no survivors. I don't remember hearing of any survivors on this wreck.
And then this is a picture on the other side of the stern then, so you can see the stern steering gear from the same dive. And kind of, if you just look below the diver then, maybe a little bit to the left, you'll actually see the barrel of one of the stern guns then. And one of the, I suppose, interesting things was this was a requisitioned ship for the Admiralty, so there was no information before we dived it with regard to how it was armed. So we were able to kind of, measure the guns and the barrels of the guns to figure what type of ammunition was used or shells were used, and then the number of guns as well that were on the ship. So again, by diving it, there was lots of stuff we were able to find out that maybe beforehand we'd very little information on. I think the other, I suppose, wreck or iconic wreck in Donegal is the Justicia then. It's the one thing that if you're diving a liner in Ireland, especially in the North Coast, you want to dive because of its bow. It has this really famous bow that Lee Bishop photographed back in the early 2000s. And I think since that photograph kind of was circulated in magazines and some of his presentations, I think everybody's wanted to go and get to the bow. And the story about the Justicia is really interesting because of the U-boats that sank it as well. So we were kind of lucky enough in the last couple of years to actually discover one of the U-boats that had a part in the sinking, and that would actually hunted down and sank a couple of hours, about 8 to 10 hours after the sinking of the Justicia. So again, there's a whole story here about the Justicia and how it was attacked, but then also the aftermath and the sinking of one of the attacking U-boats as well. And again, I suppose we're very lucky with regard to some of our shipwrecks. The bows are quite intact. But as time goes on, these will start to collapse as well. And even this photograph was taken about 2.5-3 years ago. But even since then, there's been a massive collapse. So just that photograph would have been taken in probably August 2019, I think, or July 2019. And then between 19 and 20, there had been a massive collapse again. So even the anchor there on the starboard side, beside the diver, that's nearly dropped towards the seabed now. And the hull on that side too has started to collapse behind where the anchor you can see there. So these wrecks are kind of collapsing all the time. And I suppose we're at a really lucky point in diving where we can get to them and we can see them relatively intact.
So this is what we call one of the classic wrecks. There's a sort of a handful of wrecks up there we call classics because they're all in 70 meters or less, which is 290 feet, isn't it? 70 meters?
Yeah, 290.
229, 230 feet or less. So, and you know, obviously it suits qualification levels too in trimix diving to go to 230 feet. So that's why this would be the probably slightly deeper one, if you like, of the classic. What's known as the classics, which is just a made up term, really, to be honest with you.
It kind of came from, sorry, in the late 90s, early 2000s, you'd British liveaboards would come diving on the North Coast. It was the kind of first time these wrecks were accessed. And generally they dived Audacious, they dived the Justicia, and then they also dived the Empire Heritage, which has the cargo of Sherman tanks. So the three of them together then would have generally been called the classics, and they're still kind of referred to as the classics in Donegal or in kind of Irish diving circles. And they are the kind of ones that, if you're getting into technical diving, you're getting into rebreather diving, the ones that people aspire to, because they're really easy to access with regard to visibility. They're relatively shallow compared to other shipwrecks that we have. And I suppose they're the most iconic as well. They're probably the ones that look the best because of all the ambient light we get in these kind of wrecks. So you can get lots of time, and then you can see lots on them as well.
So that bow, that shot that you just put up, Barry, doesn't really show it because she's tilting towards us in that shot. But that bow is almost 10 meters high. I don't know if that's coming across the scale. A lot of people go out in that shot there. They go out to the left as a sort of light band of a large sort of stone, large pebbles out on the left-hand side. And they go out there, and the first time people ever dive it, they all seem to go out there and kneel down on the gravel and just look straight up at the wreck. So it's quite it's some impressive sight, I can tell you.
Yeah. And the shot here is of the bow looking onto the deck of the bow. Sadly, this is kind of the one area of the bow that hasn't survived in the last 2 or 3 years. So what I was mentioning earlier about the collapse, the majority of this deck now is all collapsed on top of itself. The capstans are still there, these big circular things on the top of the deck, but other than that, there's very little else left. So just the whole deck's collapsed over winter, about 18 months, 24 months ago at this stage. And that's one of the sad things, I suppose, about diving here, is that these wrecks are over 100 years old now, because of the winter storms. Generally, they're going to deteriorate more and more as time goes on. And the real interesting thing, I suppose, as a diver is that it does accelerate year on year. So for some wrecks like the Audacious we mentioned earlier, when we dived it first, it was upside down and you couldn't see inside it, you couldn't get inside it, whereas now it's completely opened up and it's turned into a whole new wreck dive. Whereas wrecks like the Justicia has collapsed, but it's probably taken away from the visual side of the wreck a little bit, which, I suppose is disappointing at times. But one of the interesting things, I suppose, about Justicia was, we spent a lot of time over kind of 8 to 10 years trying to find one of the U-boats that attacked and sunk the Justicia, and we were lucky enough to eventually be able to pinpoint one of them, which was the UB-124. So this is the conning tower, which was blowing off the wreck. You can see kind of just the top of the conning tower lying on its side. The wreck itself, there's very little left of it. It's kind of from behind the conning tower forward has pretty much all been disintegrated in the explosion. So you can kind of see a picture here of, this is the deck gun, or one of the deck guns that would have been in front of the conning tower. And you can see in the background the conning tower itself. And then really and truly all you have is wreckage strewn over a large area of seabed. So there's very little left of the actual wreck. There's probably only about 90 feet of the wreck actually intact, and you can kind of see it here. So this is the stern. You can kind of just see at the very right of the picture, that's the stern torpedo tube, and then you can see the twisted metal just to the right of the center of the screen, and that's the propellers. So that would have been the port propeller in front of you there, and the divers there are swimming along the prop shaft. And generally, if you can look where the divers' fins are on the left of the picture. That's actually the break where it has where the wreck has been, or the edge of the explosion, basically, where the wreck doesn't exist anymore. But it's one of the real interesting dives, I suppose, as wreck divers. We all, like Stewie mentioned, there's like hundreds of World War II deadlight submarines in the area. So when we were searching over the number of years, we dropped on loads and loads of these deadlight submarines, Type 9s and Type 7s. And you got to the seabed, you looked around, you identified it maybe as a non-operational deadlight submarine. And even on this particular day, the first couple of divers came out of the water back to the boat to report, no, just another deadlight. And it wasn't really until the last couple of divers came out that even the possibility of it being an operational U-boat came to light. So most divers kind of hit the wreck, looked at the overall shape of it, and kind of said, no, there's nothing here of interest. Whereas you kind of had to look and maybe find this gun, which was a good bit off the seabed. And we actually came across some of the shells, the artillery shells as well for this gun, and they were buried in the seabed on that particular dive, which kind of helped us kind of identify that it was at least a World War I U-boat. I suppose there's only a very few of these U-boats in existence off the coast of Donegal. So once we knew it was operational, once we knew it was of a particular era as well, with regard to dates from the shells, we were able to pinpoint it down to one of a very few number, or a few select U-boats that it could have been. But the other interesting thing from this wreck site is that it's probably about 8 miles from the sinking of the Justicia, but it's over 16 miles from where it's supposed to have sank. So the reported position of the sinking of this U-boat is probably about 16 miles away from where it should have been. Which, that's one of the reasons why it took so long maybe to find it in the first place. I think then Stewie probably was happy to talk about one of his favorite wrecks is the Curacao.
Yeah, the Curacao went down in by the Queen Mary cutter in two, and just beyond where you see that diver now, that's the gun sticking up, just happens to land the right way up. But that's the bow area, the bow's to the left, and at the far side of the bow from where that diver is, there's a massive big dent, and that's exactly the shape of the Queen Mary. So what the Queen Mary was doing coming across the Atlantic with troops on board, she was zigzagging. The Curacao was, her engines were quite old and boilers, whatever, at this stage, and she was a bit clapped out and couldn't keep up because the Queen Mary was a huge ship, but was very fast, and she couldn't keep up. So in one of the zigzags, she came really, really close, and in the second time she came close, she was actually cut more or less in two parts. So the bow area, as I said here, that you see behind is upside down. The air defense platform is just about sticking out at one point there, just out of shot. And there we go. There, that's somewhere near the top, or the point above, isn't it, Barry? The air defense platform, I think.
I think that's the bridge. That's the bridge just below the air defense platform. So that's a picture of it. Actually, you can kind of see that's from the air defense platform looking down. There's an archive photograph looking down on the bridge, and then you can kind of see the remnants of it there.
So very few people dive this wreck. She's in 125 meters. What's that about?
420 feet.
Yeah, quite deep. So we certainly have put a lot of time on this, because you tend to spend a lot of time on the wreck because there's so much to see. You can see a compass pole there. You can see a voice pipe going down to the engine room right in the middle of the picture there. So you can see lots of things. And the bow, just show the plates there up near the bow, and obviously a huge anchor. She's splayed out there, lots of portholes still in place along on the way. This is on the way to the bow, going to the left of the last picture. The stern is up the right way, actually, not quite level, but almost level, and the guns are very obvious and the shells are very obvious on this.
Yeah, I don't have any photographs of the stern in this presentation. We tried to, I suppose, cut it down a little bit. But I suppose one of the most interesting things about diving something like this shipwreck is it's in two pieces. They're about half a mile apart. So they're two separate dives, considering the depth and considering the distance apart. But this is a really special dive from a point of view that it's probably only been dived 6 to 8 times ever by a boat or by divers. And out of that, even it's probably one of the most untouched shipwrecks in Ireland. Because of that, it's over 50 miles offshore. It's quite exposed to the elements, and it does take a concerted effort to get there. The marks itself would have been located during that seabed survey that I mentioned earlier. But definitely from a point of view of diving on the wreck, it's one of the few wrecks you dive on that you really get a sense that nobody's ever been there before, because everything is untouched. The crockery is just literally falling out of the side of the ship. So you can see at the bottom of this photograph, even there's a number of plates lying on the seabed. But if you swim along the whole area between here and the bow, it's just literally covered in crockery, and there's range finders and loads of other basically artifacts lying undisturbed on the seabed and it's probably one of the more, and because it's upside down, it is quite intact. But again, we've had very little information with regard to finding the bell or anything that actually identified it, other than the armaments. We were able to really identify it because of how it was armed.
We've had lots of fun on this wreck in that, the first time we tried to film it, I think it was coming into November, and we went down a big camera in the gates housing, and we got to 120 meters, everything was fine, turned it on, down to the seabed, did a sweep around to the seabed in that area, and at 125, the housing flooded, so complete write-off, obviously, of a camera. So it took conceded efforts to get the footage for what was called Deep Wreck Mysteries, as I'm sure you'll find it on YouTube. One of the saddest things I've ever seen on this wreck, and we didn't catch it for Deep Wreck Mysteries, was it's tucked in under the wreck. It was sort of undisturbed by, I don't know, nets going past or whatever, were two boots, and the two boots, full Wellington boots, the two boots were lying as if you lay down wearing your Wellington boots, and then, of course, you dissolve out of them, and they were sort of wedged in under the wreck, but fully visible. But in an area that wasn't going to get disturbed too much by, trawls or something passing by. So it was very, very, the first time we dived, it was very, very sad to see that, where clearly somebody had gone down with it and got trapped in it. I think something I alluded to earlier about the difference in the diving on the south coast of Ireland, the visibility is worse, they're much more choppy. We go out in much higher winds in Donegal, but if you're going far offshore, just for people to think, I'm going to Ireland to dive these wrecks, it's quite a challenge. And I'm telling you that because it's a fact. You're doing one dive a day, yes, but you're going out, you're spending hours on the boat going out. Some of these wrecks, you're spending hours coming back, you're hours and hours in the water. Some of our dives typically would be on those sort of depths, would be 4.5 to, well, we've done 6, that sort of thing. And you're in temperate waters. You're in 9 to 11 degrees C on the bottom. After about 2 hours coming up from, say, the Transylvania, some of those 130-meter wrecks, you eventually, after about 2 hours, started getting into slightly warmer water, maybe 12, 13 degrees C. So, you're spending a lot of time in the water. You're very tired. You're coming back, you have to do your gases, do your scrubbers and your rebreather or whatever. And then you're having to try and get a bit of food, try and get a bit of sleep, and do it all again somewhere, probably another wreck the next day. So it's quite a challenge. It is not like warm water diving. And so I would just warn people off booking to come over to Ireland and think it's a breeze. It's not. I can tell you that. What do you think, Barry?
It's a tougher holiday than most, I'd say. I think the big thing, I suppose, is giving yourself time to be acclimatized. You can't arrive over and dive the next day. And I think the north coast, the south coast, you'll see from the photographs of Lusitania, is very different. I think the north coast is good visibility, but you've got bigger seas and bigger swells. whereas the south coast is harder to get out because swells are quite short and choppy, and the visibility then is much darker and much tougher to dive in, I suppose, from a point of view of on the wreck. But the Lusitania, I suppose, is the one that everyone aspires to dive. If you're a technical diver or a wreck diver, or you're interested in liners, then I suppose behind Titanic, it's the most famous shipwreck, or one of the most famous shipwrecks in the world. And I think for Ireland, it's as Jen probably knows, it's probably one of the most protected shipwrecks in the world as well. So we're kind of really lucky in a way. All the other shipwrecks are generally protected by the same law, but they're not at the same time. So any wreck in Ireland over 100 years old falls under the National Monuments Act, and it's protected under license. But the Lusitania has a special place, so it's pretty much the only wreck that was taken under the National Monuments Act before it was 100 years old. But on top of that, you need a license like any other 100-year-old wreck nowadays. But you also need archaeologists from the government to oversee your project as you dive it. Now they're quite easy to work with. They're quite good to work with. It doesn't mean they're going to be on site every day, but you do have to work very closely with them and the owners, the museum there in Kinsale. I think it's a Signal Tower Museum. But the good thing, I suppose, as a wreck diver is that you dive it now and you look back at photographs from, the early trips to the wreck. So the likes of Lee Bishop's photographs from in around 2002 and 2003. Some of the items you can see in Lee's photographs, you can still see today on the wreck, which I think to me is very special, because a lot of the shipwrecks we dive that are in the shallower waters or that have been dived a lot in the last 20 years haven't got a whole lot more to see in them unless you go very, very deep and you go like 400 meters or 400 feet more. You're probably going to find very little telegraphs and bells and whistles, whereas you go in Lusitania, you're going to see a lot. So like a picture like this with the steam whistles, I know for me, I've probably seen these steam whistles 12 to 15 times on the wreck. And I know there's been projects where they've tried to remove them or tried to lift them, but it's amazing to be able to come back year on year and see these items. And the same with the telegraph. So this telegraph here is actually just one of the stern telegraphs. I think what's most amazing about this telegraph that you can't see in the photograph is there's actually two telegraphs back to back, side by side, two separate telegraphs that are falling together. So I think, Jen, on your recent trip to Ireland, I think you guys were in the same area. But what I found really, really interesting, I suppose, we hadn't dived these until last year ourselves. We hadn't dived the stern properly. But I was able to come across Lee Bishop's images from one of his earlier trips, and these two telegraphs were in his photographs as well, and they're pretty much in identical positions. There's a little bit of movement, but as a wreck diver, I suppose it's one of the most amazing things to be able to visit a wreck. But you can kind of see the visibility here is quite poor. It's harder to wreck to navigate. It's quite broken as well because of all the depth charging that went on. Especially in World War II, and it was used as well for practice for both the British government or the British Navy and the Irish Navy with regard to that. One of the, I suppose, iconic things from my days on it was coming across one of the bats with the shower head on the bat. Sadly, the two have been separated now since this photograph was taken, probably in around 2012. Since then, the bat and the shower has kind of separated. They are still there, but they're not together. And it's probably one of my own regrets that I came across it, kind of photographed it. My plans were always to go back and do some more photography on the bat and the shower, and maybe even do photogrammetry. That was the plan. And then by the time we came back, it had been damaged by either nets or by trawls or something like that. But it's one of the most amazing shipwrecks I've ever dived. And even this year, I think, or last year now, sorry, it was really interesting seeing different groups diving the wreck, which is probably last year was the first year where we had like 4 or 5 different groups dive the wreck. We had the guys, Jennifer and the guys diving the wreck. We had other trip organizer Peter McCamley having multiple weeks on the wreck, and the wreck has been dived, I suppose more in the last 24 months than it's ever been dived previously, which is great to see from a wreck diving point of view. But you come across things like this. So this is the stained glass windows that are near the stern as well. And probably most of you have seen these from either Jennifer's group. They had some amazing photographs of these. But it's really interesting from a point of view of wreck diving. That's, you know, it's amazing to come down and be able to see stuff like the stained glass windows just lying on the seabed. And this is lying on the sand, maybe 10 meters off the wreck, at the edge of the wreckage. But I dived this wreck, you know, probably 12 to 15 times, but we'd never got to this area before ourselves. And it's really nice to be able to pick your way through the wreck and find things that you've probably never seen before and you won't come across very easily. I don't know, Stewie, have you anything to say on it?
Well, I totally agree. I had done the stern before. In fact, I had got down to the props. I don't know if you've got a prop picture there. Yeah. So this is just screen grabs from a video. So I made a point on this, the last dive of this last trip last year was to go down and do some video going down. You're effectively going down. The hull is above your head. The blown off prop is to your left, back about 10 meters to your left, 10 meters to your left, and just going down basically a tunnel of steel, a tapering tunnel of steel. And the seabed is really muddy and mucky. So you end up with your breather basically rubbing along the hull, and there's steel both sides of you. It doesn't really show it in that picture, but the steel both sides of you. And I got into the right there of the bottom picture, to the right of that blade, and that's the only propeller that remains on the wreck. The other 3 were taken away, and one of them was melted down for golf clubs. Apparently, there wasn't great allure for these golf clubs, so they didn't do well. There's 2 others that are still available to see. One of them I know is in Liverpool. You can see it down the docks there, lying on our back. But it's quite interesting. It's really, really tight on that corner on the right-hand side of the bottom image, and I was able to poke the lights and the camera through there and film where she goes into the hull and everything. So that was something I had seen maybe, well, I don't know, 12, 14 years ago or something. And I was on my own at the time and I didn't have a camera. So this time I made an absolute point of getting back there to see the only remaining prop, underwater, yeah.
Yeah, I think myself, I'm happy to look at your photographs and video of that propeller. I don't think myself I would ever want to go that far under the hull, in that kind of hole.
I can assure you it's the closest thing to cave diving I'm ever going to do, and I don't intend to do any cave diving. I'm not cut out for it, I suppose. But the fish, I don't know, that fish on the top left of the bottom picture is actually a pollock, I think, and they're quite big, so it's very, very hard, I think, to get scale in that image, which is a pity. Anyway, it's pretty big.
I'd say you're the first and only person that'll probably ever go down into that hole. Yeah.
It's not nice, actually, because you turn around to go back out, and no matter how careful you are, you're just looking at a wall of viz, 1 or 2 feet of viz. So that's the sad thing about going in there, because you're literally bellies and your breathers are rubbing for the last few meters just to get to that point there. But it's lovely to see it. I must say, the whole hull is resting on it. Now, I'm not going to take Barry's glory away from on this one.
No, you can talk about this.
So this telegraph was from further up near the bridge, up at the bridge, out on the sand. It was sent up by another group. It went back down. There was some issue with, I think, the lifting bag, and it went back down. And I think that might be part of the lifting bag, maybe ropes there. And we were on a 3-day trip with Pat Cotton, I think, on this occasion. This is not last year. It's a few years ago, 2017, in fact, trying to remember. And we got permission then when we advised that we found, it was pure chance that we found that. Barry, you found it. It's pure chance that Barry found it because it just happened to see the color of the lifting bag just off to one side of the wreck out in the sand. with visibility being bad, I suppose the color showed up rather than the actual artifact. And you went out and had a look, came back to the boat, reported it to the heritage people, and they said, try and secure to the wreck. So dive 2 was putting a rope around it and tying it to something over on the left, I think, as I look at that picture, and tying it to something very solid on the wreck. And then dive 3, by the time dive 3 happened on day 3, and there was only 3 days diving on that trip that were available to dive because of weather and everything. And on day 3, we were allowed to bring it up under very, very particular circumstances that we'd always have a connection to it, independent of lift bags. So we'd always have we dropped down, actually, I think, a rope and a float. So even if it went up and went back down for the second time, it would still be recoverable by just hauling in a rope, basically. And all the communication chain from the telegraph to the engine room was put in a bag, and the whole center of that can fall out. So that was obviously tied to the body of it, and then the body of it was tied to the lifting bag. So this unfortunately, this telegraph became famous in a bad way for a bad reason, and that it went back down, and then there was a big sort of a big row. It went all the way up to government level as to how come this thing could be lost, when in fact there it is, it's found, and I think everyone's happy again. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Barry.
No, I think one of the goals long term that the owners of the wreck have is to develop a museum on the old head of Kinsale, and to bring artifacts up. Over the years, myself and Stuart have been lucky to be involved in a number of kind of artifact recovery projects, but it is quite challenging, not from a point of view of maybe locating artifacts on the wreck, but actually from a point of view of negotiating with the government on being able to recover them. I think the biggest challenge going forward for something like Lusitania, because there's so much diving going on at the moment on the wreck, there's so much evidence of what's there as well at the moment. The big challenge will be finding a suitable location, probably to store the artifacts and put them on display, and then the financing of the restoration of the artifacts, and then also the long-term kind of preservation and inside the museum with regard to storage and security. And I suppose there's great work being done at the moment down in Kinsale about that, and they are working very hard to develop this new museum. But it's quite hard, I suppose, from a diver's point of view, that all we want to do is go down and see these artifacts and take photographs of them and maybe recover them. But there's a lot more going on, and like Stewie alluded to, Lusitania is a bit of a strange one. If we dive in any other shipwreck in Ireland or pretty much in the world, nobody cares. Whereas even for this photograph here, you take this photograph, you recover the artifact, the New York Times will want that photograph as well. And that's where you're kind of, it isn't a normal shipwreck. It generally attracts attention, good or bad, very, very easily. And it is one of the things about the wreck that I would have my own love-hate relationship with it, because you can't just go and have a nice quiet diving week on it, because generally if anything happens, good or bad, it's blown out of proportion. But saying that, I suppose it's one of the wrecks that historically it's one of the most exciting wrecks you'll ever dive. I think that's pretty much us.
That picture was taken by Barry, a diver, an Irish diver called Rez, and that picture actually is 100% Barry's, and that was on the, as he probably quickly said there, New York Times. So that picture became quite famous, would you believe? It went around the world a little bit, viral. So is that the end of it, Barry?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much us there.
Question time now, maybe.
Thank you so much. If people have questions, put them in the chat. I can tell you the photographers are all going bonkers at these photos because they're so beautiful. And I'll see a photographer come on, and then the next thing I see, their friends who are also photographers popping on. So they're saying, hey, check these photos out. You can tell. They're absolutely beautiful. So we do have one question so far. How do you organize an expedition to the Lusitania if you want to go?
I suppose the first thing is you need to put a light. There's two applications. There's an application to dive it to the owners, so the Signal House Museum or in Kinsale, so they're the owners. So you have to apply to them and ask for permission. Once you get permission from them, you can then apply to the government through a special department that look after underwater heritage. And again, they have a license application, basically form to fill out. You submit a meta statement and a plan for your diving activities. And I suppose from that point of view, it can't be a recreational trip. So there has to be a scientific or a historical reason for your expedition to the wreck site. So generally, something like photography and documentation of the current condition of the wreck would suffice. So if you're carrying cameras and you hand over the footage after the dives, that's generally enough to get access to the wreck. But they are quite clear it isn't a tourist site and it isn't a site for recreational diving or technical diving for a tourist point of view. So it is trying to strike a balance between having a reason to be there or giving them enough of a reason to be there to allow you to have access. I think generally though, it's once you have your license then in place, it's quite easy to, there's one main dive boat, I suppose in the area called the Sea Hunter. They're quite experienced in the area. They've got a good setup with regard to a diver's lift for taking divers in and out of the water. And then logistics are probably the only real main challenge then. So getting your gas and getting your cylinders and getting your line and your other kind of diving equipment that you're not going to fly with in Kinsale. And again, there's various options with regard to that. But I suppose the trickiest thing, I suppose, is getting permissions from the museum and the government. Once they're in position, it's quite basic logistics after that. The wreck itself is only 12 miles from the harbour, so it's quite a short day out. It's only half an hour to 40 minutes onto site, and so it's quite accessible, I think, in general. The good thing, I suppose, in the last couple of years though has been there's been loads of different trips. There's been 4 to 5 different organisers of expeditions in the last kind of 2 years, which is great to see. Back 15 years ago when we dived it first, or when I dived it first, and there was probably 2 people that organised trips. That was it. And unless you knew them people or you had access to their contacts, it was quite difficult. So it is slowly opening up.
I think, Jen, you used a different charter boat as far as I remember. Do you remember the name of the
we
boat?
were with the Sea Hunter with Gavin.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Cool,
Mhm.
cool.
Yeah,
Okay.
there is a couple of other smaller boats, but the Sea Hunter is probably the best setup. Yeah, I think the main challenge, I suppose, if you get your licensing in place, and that has to be done pretty much 6 months to 10 months in advance. Once you kind of get that done, maybe this time of year, you can, and there's generally then they'll allocate a period of time for you. So it could be a week expedition, it could be a 2-week expedition. You have to assign your dates as well. That's the only other thing. So you are fixed to your dates, which is, from a point of view, maybe traveling from America is not a problem. For us, maybe in Ireland, the challenge is if it's bad weather, you can't roll your dates to another day. That's the problem. But
So, somebody wanted to know if you have ever worked with a Dr. Innes McCartney on the U-boats, on Irish U-boats. I'm sorry, U-boats in Ireland. Dr. Innes McCartney.
The funny thing is we worked with them on, I think it was Deep Wreck Mysteries or one of those programs, or maybe the one that came after that. And the irony of it was, a lot of the ships that have gone down have been involved with submarines up there in Donegal, but typically, we have worked with them in the past. It's quite a while ago since we worked with them, actually. I know in some of the stuff we do, the producers work with Axel Niesle in Germany, and there's a chap called Papadopoulos in America. I'm trying to think of his name. So Innes is the British expert, absolutely. And we do know him, and we have worked with them, but they sometimes, there are other experts as well, obviously, and Dr. Axel Niesle in Germany has some amazing records on everything to do with the U-boat. Records on every person who was on each U-boat, and that sort of level of detail, it's phenomenal. Yeah. And he can generally pin down on the programs we've been involved in over the years, the different documentaries. He can pin down beyond class So he can actually not just say it's a Type 9 or a Type 7C or whatever, he can pin it down to the actual number of the U-boat, which is quite exceptional because, you know, from the information we give, looking at the video carefully, and you don't just go down on these wrecks and see, you know, U124 something painted on the side of it. It never happens that way. Look, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think Axel would have been one of the historians we would have contacted after finding the U-boat that sank the Justicia, UB124, and he would have been probably one of the main reasons we were able to identify it as, you know, within any doubt it being UB124. So yeah, we would try to get as much kind of outside help as we could or can when we're trying to identify stuff, especially the U-boats, because it is, I suppose, a black art sometimes when you're trying to identify stuff that, you know, is quite similar, and also to distinguish numbers of U-boats of a certain type is quite hard as well. So I think with Ennis, I think most of the stuff we worked on him with him was on the Audacious. We spent a good bit of time with him, even on the Audacious and that project for the Deep Wreck Mysteries. And again, he's like a encyclopedic knowledge of anything to do with shipwrecks and U-boats.
Now for the most important question by gentleman.
Well, I was going to save that one for last, Joe.
I recognize that voice.
He wants to know how the ice cream is in Ireland. This guy named Barney.
Don't worry.
I heard he's lactose intolerant.
I've replied to him.
So yeah, Barney's the kind of guy now that if you hear he's diving in Ireland, you tend to dive in America that week because the weather's going to be very bad in Ireland if he's there.
So somebody asked a question. Yeah, oh, sorry, it's been answered. Yeah, NIESTLE. That's correct. Yeah.
And then there's one last question about mapping, whether these wrecks have been mapped.
So from a point of view of the locations, is it?
That was all the question is. I don't know if whoever it is wants to just ask or.
Yeah, so I think if I go back to one of the earlier one, we have basically this area, the seabed around Ireland has all been mapped. Sorry, here. And if you zoom in, so this is all of there's a free web viewer. What I can do is I can put a link into the I can maybe link it to or give it to you, Jen, maybe. But basically anybody from anywhere in the world can log on to a particular website and view all the wrecks, and they can actually click on the wrecks and basically see the multi-beam images of most of these wrecks. Now there is some of them that are scanned at that much higher resolution than others. But yeah, the majority of the wrecks we've mentioned in this presentation, I think, are all part of the Seabed Survey of Ireland. Yeah, I think every one of them we've mentioned. Actually, the only one that wouldn't be part of the Seabed Survey of Ireland is the U-boat UB124. It hasn't shown up on the survey. The mark would have came from another location, from a fisherman for that particular wreck. But all the other wrecks were all kind of found at the Cursor, which was found because of the Seabed Survey Mapping Project. The Victoria would have been the same. It was only dived in 2006, and one of the first surveys would have covered that.
Right.
So you've got some other beautiful wrecks up there, liners like the RMS Amazon, about 40 odd miles out northwest of Donegal, and it's a very popular wreck. She's upright and very popular. The Transylvania, HMS Transylvania, with guns on her and, you know, protection guns, and she was a massive ship too. Again, northwest in 131 meters. The deepest wreck we've done up there is 163 meters, the Empress of Britain, and it's way out west. You literally leave where we leave from, up on the top left-hand corner there of Ireland and northwest, and we just go literally west, and we pass an island called Tory, and we just keep going for 70-something miles. So we have to bring a sat phone because obviously VHF's not going to stretch that distance, or obviously phone and things are not going to stretch. So we that's a very exciting wreck for us to do as well.
That wreck is, I think if you look on the chart there, if you see at the top of Ireland, there's HMS Cursor. The U basically part is roughly where the Empress is lying. And if you're 4 or 5 miles west of the wreck, you're probably in about 120 meters. The wreck itself is in 160. But when we finished our decompression at the end of that day, we drifted west, so we were drifting further out off the shelf. I think when we finished deco, we were 4 to 5 miles west of the wreck, but we were in over 400 meters of water. So it really does drop quite quickly at that point. You're really at the continental shelf, and once you go beyond that wreck at all, you're kind of going down a big slope. And for us, it's one of the closest points in Ireland, or very close to the closest point in Ireland to the continental shelf, which you can see in that. But it's again a very special wreck. It hasn't really been dived much by divers. There's only been 2 groups on it. And there's other wrecks as well, shallower wrecks like we mentioned a little bit, one of the classics, the Empress or the Empire Heritage. And we didn't cover it in the presentation here, but it has a cargo of Sherman tanks. And again, there's very few places in the world you can dive a shipwreck that's covered in Sherman tanks. That's again, it's like a kid's playground when it comes to that.
So, do you guys have any publications? Somebody just want to know if there's any books or any publications that you have that folks should check out.
No,
I know you mentioned the YouTube deep wrecks.
No, we keep everything secret, Jen. We don't tell anyone what we do. I'm amazed we're actually even here.
I think Barney promised to bring good weather next time if we talk here. So,
Well,
okay. If they can probably check out if they kind of look at it, either of us on Facebook, they'll be able to kind of come across images. I think we've talked about a coffee table book for too long at this stage, but at this point now we've never done a proper publication. I think lots of myself and Stewie's images are in various other publications. There's a very nice publication on the Cunard, it's Cunard, isn't it? Book with both our images. There is a very nice book you can buy online in Ireland on basically the wrecks of Ireland. Was it? I think Stuart knows the name properly. U-boats, liners, and
Warships, U-boats, liners, which is the exactly same name as this presentation, and that's where it was robbed from. It's a government publication, and it does a couple of pages on each wreck. And the beauty about it is the actual coordinates in that publication are exactly correct. You don't have to double check them or anything. So that was the whole premise of that government publication, is that anything that's in there would be accurate. We were still finding wrecks that didn't quite make the cut in that book at the time, which was a pity, because there was some nice ones after that. And that came out about, how long ago was that? About 6, 7 years ago that book came out. And
probably longer ago. I think the images were all taken in 2007 and 8, and it was published in maybe, so they're quite old. Even the images now are quite old compared to the last couple of years.
Yep. Cameras have become so good now, relatively. The sensors have become so good that, because all these wrecks are deep, so therefore, the light is well filtered out to the top 25 meters of plankton, which you have to get through,
Well, I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat anywhere. Thank you both so much. This was really amazing, and I really appreciate you guys staying up so late to be here. Next week is actually a recommendation of Stuart's as well. Is David Strike is going to be presenting to us from Australia on the hunt for the HMS Affray. So he'll get the record for being the furthest person to present, but you guys still get the record for staying up the latest for us. So we really appreciate that.
Thank you very much, Jen. Appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.